Hey there guys, we're taking a look at Just Cause 4 running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U. So we took a look at Just Cause 3 and that really was bordering on the edge of playability in a lot of situations, but really at 720p at the higher TDPs, it was doable. So taking a look at the game here, we're running it at 1080p with the lowest in-game graphics settings at the stock 15 watt TDP. And it's an interesting situation because we are definitely getting a pretty low average here for the most part. But the average that we're getting is so low that it's actually very in line with the 1% lows for the most part, that in a lot of sections it does feel really playable, though that's not really the case the entirety of the time. Once the action really kicks up, the 1% lows drop pretty intensely and it just does not become a playable experience at all. So 1080p is really completely out of the question at the stock settings. Of course, we can drop the resolution down to 720p to see if we can't squeeze out a bit more performance out of this. Now at 720p, we do see a very nice bump in the averages, though the 1% lows really don't see as big of an improvement as you'd like to see. We're mostly still hovering at a 20-ish FPS range. It really just stays around the 20s, and it does make the experience just a bit rough because we're essentially losing half of the FPS in those 1% lows. But if you look at the frame time charts, they do stay relatively smooth a lot of the time. It's just moments of intense action and a lot of explosions happening can bring things down. So it's still not the most ideal experience, though it is at a range now where I feel like a lot of people might be able to just get away with playing. Still not the most ideal situation, but we are at a range now where I think it should be at least acceptable for some people, while I feel like 1080p was completely out of the question. Now if we use the AMD APU tuning utility to raise the TDP up to 25 watts, we run into an interesting situation at 1080p where we are now at least bumping up the 1% lows to be more in line with the averages, and the averages are at the 30 range. So if you're fine with a very older console experience, you can actually get that out of 1080p if you're willing to raise the TDP, though I don't really think it's worth it, just because we can get a little bit more performance in this just by dropping down the resolution. You're really just pushing a lot just to try to make 1080p be at the edge of playability here, where for the most part the 1% lows look fine most of the time, and the frame time charts are showing that it is going to be a consistent experience most of the time. You will have the occasional stutter here and there, and you could just avoid a lot of that if you just go down in resolution instead of trying to force 1080p here. Of course, dropping the resolution down to 720p might net us a gain here that will actually be a pretty enjoyable experience. Now 720p does become a far more playable experience here with 1% lows that are just slightly under 30 and averages that are in the 40s range. It's definitely a more enjoyable experience, though it's still not the most ideal. I would definitely like to be closer to 60, but this is so much more playable than where we were at before, and this really can actually be an enjoyable experience, especially if you just don't have an FPS counter and you just focus on playing in the game. There will be moments with intense action explosions that will drop those 1% lows, but for the most part it's still going to be a enjoyable experience. Of course, this isn't the most we can do with this chip. We can boost up the TDP up to 30 watts to try to squeeze out a bit more performance, though that does start to get into some more dangerous territory. So I really would recommend just trying to stay at most at the 25 watt TDP. That would be going with the balance reset in the APU tuning utility. So I just want to preface all that before we go on to the performance preset, because the performance preset is really something that I just don't recommend for the vast majority of people, because most systems that have this low end of a chip end up being relatively cheap, and especially when it comes to the cooling, and I really don't want you guys risking your systems just to try to squeeze out a bit more performance in games. It's really not worth it. So with the performance preset setting a target TDP of 30 watts, we pretty much end up in a situation at 1080p where we're now at a 30 FPS average with 1% lows that, while still in the low 20s, or at least closer to a far more playable experience here. This is going to still feel like a previous generation console experience, although I guess it's not even previous generation at this point. I'm talking more PS3, Xbox 360 era console experience here. And really, overall, what we're getting out of this is going to be at least playable, but really, I just don't think you should just play the game like this. 1080p is just out of the question. Really, even pumping up enough heat in here that we're starting to reach temperatures where I'm uncomfortable with, I just don't think that you're getting the level of performance that would justify risking your hardware. Now, if we drop things down to 720p, we do see a nice bump in the 1% lows here, though it's still not going up over 30 FPS, which is where I would really like to see it. We're not really seeing as big of an uplift as you would like to see, especially because, again, we're getting into temperatures that I'm personally just not comfortable with. I really don't recommend you play your games like this. If you're getting these temperatures, just don't run it at this high of a TDP. It's really not worth it. You're not getting anywhere near a gain versus the amount of temperature that we're seeing a rise of here. This is almost 20 degrees more heat over just the stock setting for almost no real world gain here. And really, it's not too surprising because of the fact that when AMD was designing these chips, they pretty much go for the efficiency side of things. So there is an efficiency curve where you're already getting most of the performance just from running at the stock setting. And the higher that you start to raise the TDP, even if you double it, you're not getting twice as much performance. You're usually at most going to see a 30 to 40% uplift, which means that there are diminishing returns. And especially because a lot of the times the gains aren't even really there, and most of them can be had at the 25 watt TDP. The extra 5 watts here just raises the temperature a lot more, and you gain practically nothing. And of course, at the complete other end of the TDP spectrum, we have the battery saver preset. Now, I currently only have this running at 720p. 1080p was just completely out of the question, that I just decided I'll just show you 720p since it actually runs and it's not literally just pretty much a still image. So the 8 watt TDP is really out of the question for both 1080p and 720p. It really is just a PowerPoint presentation here. It's not going to be doable. Again, it's not, you're already at the efficiency curve with the 15 watt TDP. Going down lower, you're going to sacrifice a lot of performance. Going up higher, you're really at diminishing returns. So if you're at the stock setting for most games, you're probably going to be fine. If you can squeeze out a little bit more TDP, if you can raise it manually to 20 watts, or you want to go all the way up to 25, you're going to see some nice gains, but anything past that is really diminishing. Now, that's not the case all of the time. There are certain games that really benefit from the extra juice going to the CPU, but very, very rarely is that the case. But it's why a tool like the APU tuning utility existing is actually really nice, because a lot of the times the games that really benefit from that extra juice to the CPU really only need it for 1, maybe 2 cores, and at that point the temperature increase that you're getting is not really as high as you would expect it to be. It's definitely one of those things where there's a little bit of trial and error in all of this, trying things out, seeing what actually gives you the best levels of performance. Usually demanding AAA games tend to not benefit really from those higher TDPs. But anyways, I hope you found this video useful. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I will catch you in the next one.